a man was buried, and then he left his grave and went back and to his house, went to bed with his wife, and then he almost squashed her. She freaked out, started screaming, and the neighbors came and made this dead man leave. But for me, it seems a little bit he forgot that he was dead. So he just left his grave, went home, went to bed as he would do every other day. And then he didn't understand what happened and why everybody was upset.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Resurrectionist podcast. This week, we are joined by Polina Ignatova. Polina has a PhD in medieval history from the University of Lancaster, where she was looking at the Walking Dead narratives in medieval English texts. She's also done postdoctoral research on how aquatic animals are studied in the medieval ages and how this affects contemporary representation of aquatic animals and sea monsters in films and video games, which is very fascinating to me. She's also the series editor for Trident Publishing. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you for letting me be here.
So when you first reached out to me, it was about your PhD topic, which we are definitely going to discuss because it's on brand and on theme for the podcast, which is The Walking Dead in medieval English texts. But I have to ask, because while I was researching you, I did see your postdoctoral research, and it's so interesting to me. I never thought about medieval fish and then how they relate to sea monsters and films and video games. So could you just maybe talk a little bit about that to satiate my own curiosity?
So I was completing my PhD project, and I was thinking, what do I want to do with my postdoctoral project? And I was looking at some of the Walking Dead, which were described to turn into animals. So there is a narrative coming from the life and miracles of Saint Madwena, from composed by Geoffrey Burton. And Geoffrey Burton described the Walking Dead who occasionally turned into bears and dogs and some unspecified animals. And I got to look in the symbolic role of the bear in medieval England to understand why Geoffrey actually wanted to portray his undead as turning into bears. And I went down this rabbit hole of really fascinating animal studies. And then I was discussing my plans with my supervisor, Dr. Paul Hayward of Lancaster University was my PhD supervisor. And we kind of brainstormed that fish would be an interesting animal to focus a project on. And it also corresponded with the fact that one of my friends lended me a collection of Lovecraft's horror stories. And Lovecraft writes a lot about this kind of human-fish hybrids, not exactly human fish, but humans and the people whom Lovecraft calls the deep ones. So there's this fantastical humanoid creatures who have lots of fish-like characteristics. And obviously we know that Lovecraft was incredibly racist. So for him, this kind of fish people, he tried to describe them as horrendous and disgusting and repulsive. But I was totally fascinated by them. Because the shadow over Innsmouth, he describes this town populated by this fish folk. And it was a horror story, but at the same time, these creatures seemed so interesting for me. And from that point, I think I started being interested in this borderline we have in our culture between humans and non-human animals, and what constitutes humanity in our mind, and what is animality in a way in our mind, and how these characteristics can mix with each other. And that's how I arrived into monstrous fish, I suppose.
It was just, I saw it and I was like, I have to ask because this sounds so interesting.
I've enjoyed this project. I had really lots of fun working on it.
So, to get back to the reason you are here today, to talk about your PhD, which was on The Walking Dead and the narratives of The Walking Dead in medieval English literature. So how did you first get interested in this topic? Because it's something that I didn't even realize existed, really, I guess, at all.
I think I may be a bad student in a way because I have arrived in lots of research ideas kind of accidentally. And with this, so I did my master's in medieval history. I came there from a non-historical background, so I used to study for international relations, and then I realized that I'm so disappointed in the international relations. I don't want to touch it anymore ever again. So I was doing my master's kind of without the sufficient background. So it was a little bit like stumbling in the dark, really. And I had this book on a collection of medieval ghost stories, which I picked in a gift shop, actually. And it was very fun to read. And I ended up writing my master's dissertation inspired by this book on this supernatural phenomena in the 12th century English sources. And during that point, I became interested in horror studies and what do we find horrifying and why certain things horrify us. So I wanted to continue doing it as my PhD research. And during the first year of my PhD, I narrowed it down to Walking Dead. I find Walking Dead specifically fascinating because studying them combines different fields of history. So you can work with narratives, you can work with textual sources, but at the same time, you can also work with excavation reports because some scholars argue that some Anglo-Saxon burials, for example, bear traces of people taking measures to prevent the buried bodies from rising. John Blair wrote an article about it. So you can look into all different perspectives. You can also study religious thought, because again, this idea of the dead resurrecting to face the final judgment was really prominent, obviously, in medieval Christian Europe. At the same time, Saint Augustine, who was incredibly influential, of course, in the medieval thought, he described in a really detailed way what happens to the body and the soul when we face the judgment day. And I always, like, when I was reading Saint Augustine, I always felt like he would probably be the closest to convert me if I if I was to convert, because his writings are so logical, like almost scientific. So he kind of answers all the questions one might have about Christianity. And then, like, again, there are Thomas Aquinas's ideas about how soul and body are interrelated. So the soul cannot really exist without bodies. So our bodies are not just something, which pushes us towards seeing something, which gets ill, something which decomposes after death. It's like a really important part of one's being. And speaking of that, there was also a period in my research when I was super interested in what happens to the body after death and how people in the past used to interpret it. I'm coming from a medical background, so my mom and my elder brother are doctors, so we kind of had, so in my family, like, having disgusting conversations at like dinner table was normalized. And I was really fascinated during my research by the book written by Paul Barber, who looked into the Eastern European early modern vampire beliefs. And he argued that whatever was happening to the body after death was potentially interpreted by people as evidence that that person was not resting peacefully, and like there was some activity happening, like so his body was leaving the grave, for example. So like the best thing about Walking Dead, I think, is there's like how many different approaches you can incorporate into your research.
Mm. Yeah, it really seems like there's a lot of different things that go into it as well. So when I originally think about The Walking Dead, I think about the modern sort of like zombies that you see in movies and TV shows, specifically the TV show The Walking Dead is what immediately came to mind. So, but I'm guessing that they're not exactly the same. So what are the differences between maybe the medieval version of A Walking Dead and what we would see as zombies today?
I would say they're quite close. I used to call medieval Walking Dead zombies for convenience. It's not a perfect practice because if you do it in an academic context, somebody would raise their hand and say, but I have a comment, you cannot say zombie because the word didn't exist in the European language at that point, the European languages. But I think the general idea is pretty much the same, that there is a body which for some reason does not stay dead. And it's kind of like medieval Walking Dead. They're not fully resurrected individuals, so they're not like Lazarus. They are, for example, miracles performed by saints when they resurrect people, and these miracles appear in medieval Lives of Saints collections. And sometimes, like again, in case of Saint Madwena, the same collection has miracles when Saint Madwena returns dead people back to life. And also it contains this episode when Saint Madwena turns people into the Walking Dead. And these are completely different. The result of Madwena's intervention, the results of Madwena's intervention are different. So when the person is returned from the dead to a fully living, functional body, everybody is, of course, happy and glad. But the Walking Dead, they're not invited back into the human society. So people are afraid of them and they try their best to get rid of them. So like zombies, they are in this kind of awkward position between life and death. Like zombies, medieval Walking Dead are described to decompose, but not always. Sometimes they do not decompose at all, and it's also interpreted as something weird and abnormal. So they are not they're excluded from this natural process of decomposition and giving life to plants and worms which feed on this dead body. I would say, obviously, we are very secularized, very secular society. So the horror films, most of them need to provide a secular explanation why like in this catastrophic situation, which they portray, like the dead people come back to life, and they usually say that it's some kind of virus of which keeps the like part of the brain activity. And I would argue that it's something similar to how medieval individuals described the undead, because in the Middle Ages there were like two reasons why a person would turn into a walking corpse. One of them is that their soul is stuck inside the dead body and it cannot exit. And the soul is not happy about it. So the soul really wants to leave the dead body and move on to the afterlife. So it's kind of like, corpse bride situation, to simplify it. Another reason is when the devil enters a dead body and wears it kind of as a costume. And this is also obviously very terrifying for a medieval individual. We can imagine that that after death, your body potentially will not find peace, but will do God knows what, being the devil's puppet. Sometimes this, in some narratives, the devil had sex with living individuals using this undead body, which is incredibly creepy, of course. But I would say that this modern version of this narrative, when a virus enters a dead body, is kind of similar, because this is kind of an invisible entity, like the devil in the Middle Ages, which we cannot control, we cannot grasp it, we cannot, unless we are virologists, we cannot completely comprehend how it works and what it is. With the soul, going back to the soul stuck inside the dead body. So some Walking Dead in the medieval context, they kind of preserve the remains of their personality, and they are described to have some memories left from when they were alive. For example, I really like the story recorded by William of Newborough in the History of English Affairs, when a man was buried and then he left his grave and went back and to his house and went to bed with his wife, and then he almost squashed her, and she freaked out, started screaming, and the neighbors came and made this dead man leave. And there are different interpretations of this story. So some scholars argue that it's kind of this creepy narrative when this dead man tried to rape his living wife. But for me, it seems a little bit he forgot that he was dead. So he just left his grave, went home, went to bed, as he would do every other day. And then he didn't understand what happened and why everybody was upset. And again, we see this in some of the narratives created by the horror films, when sometimes the Walking Dead are portrayed to maintain their former personality. I think it was in one of the Ramirez films. I think it was Day of the Dead or Night of the Dead. Good question. Yes, I forgot which one it was, but there is this crazy. Yeah, exactly. It's different types of the day and night of the dead. But yeah, I think it was Day of the Dead. Yes. So basically, there is this crazy scientist who tries to train zombies, and to tame them. And his favorite zombie is called Bob, and he used to be a military guy. And at some point, he tries to salute him, and he remembers how to use the phone. So it's kind of, again, creepy, sad, adorable situation. But where I'm getting to in a rather long and rambly way is that what medieval individuals understood as this kind of remaining personality, as the person's soul, in the modern context, we explain by this kind of reduced function of the brain, which still functions inside a zombie's head, but in a different way from the living. Of course, nowadays, every zombie film contains lots of zombies, but in the medieval narratives, it's maximum 2 people. I would say the gender dynamics is also quite interesting. So most zombies in the medieval narratives are men. For some reason, there are very few zombie women.
Interesting. Yeah. So when I was reading, so you've got a paper and you've been published in books and stuff as well. So when I was reading through one of the ones that you sent over, you're talking about ghosts and the Walking Dead and how sometimes in medieval literature you're not sure if they're talking about Walking Dead or like ghosts. So what is it that's like not clear? Like what is it that's not, you're not able to differentiate between the two in the literary?
Sometimes the narrator would just write that a dead person would come back, and you wouldn't know what they actually meant, if it was supposed to be a ghost or if it was supposed to be a walking corpse. I would say that in English sources, they usually tried to differentiate quite clearly, and you can see it in the vocabulary which they were used. So they were using a lot the Latin word mortus, for example, so which means the dead person, or they would say again cadaver, which means the cadaver. So that would be quite straightforward. However, there is a very famous collection of ghost stories produced in the beginning, like in the very beginning of the 15th century, in the Byland Epi. And the ghosts there are quite corporeal, so one can touch them. So there is a story which again fascinates me because there is like no explanation of a woman who caught a ghost, and she kind of carried it on her back home and was showing it to people. And kind of everybody saw that her fingers were kind of sinking inside the ghost's body. So it was kind of also squishy. And that's it. So we don't get any explanation why she caught the ghost, why its body was of this particular kind of texture. We assume that it was the ghost. We know that it was the ghost because the narrator was using the word spiritus, so it's the spirit. But otherwise, it has like these characteristics of something tangible and corporeal. The same applies to another story recorded in the collection when there was a person who tried to hit a ghost, and it was like it didn't take any damage, but the living person could hear the sound as if somebody is beating like a pillow or a bed. I think now when I'm talking about it, I think that probably scholars who study the medieval thought on like the composition of the soul and the composition of the spirits, and like if the soul is composed of some sort of matter, can comment on it. So if somebody who listens to this podcast has a comment, I would be very interested to learn more about this, because this is something I don't know anything about.
I just found it interesting, how you sort of highlighted that, like, clearly for some authors, it wasn't important whether they were Walking Dead or ghosts because they weren't taking the time to differentiate between the two, or specifically state like these are corpses that are walking versus these are spirits.
Yes, I think we actually know very little about medieval mentalities, and I suppose these different types of entities could be differentiated between, because there are some differences in the narratives because between the Walking Dead and the ghosts. But at the same time, some sources indeed do not seem to specify it in great detail. So probably the moral message of the story was considered to be more important than like the philosophical thought behind it, or like because Walking Dead invite lots of thought, I suppose, about like the relationship between the body and the soul before and after death.
So you mentioned kind of briefly that like some of the Walking Dead are like from saints sort of like resurrecting people, or it's something like that. Is that how they're all created, or are there sort of different origin stories of like how they become sort of these restless Walking Dead?
So in some cases we don't know. So the man who came back to his home, it's not explained why it happened. It's implied that he was a sinner because after actually Bishop Hugh of Lincoln, allegedly, obviously, like it's not a real life story, of course, but in the narrative, Bishop Hugh of Lincoln wrote the letter of absolution for him. And after that, he walked no more. So the general logic was that obviously nothing in the world can happen without the permission from the god, according to the medieval worldview. And what happens is the saint wants to punish an individual, and God lets them, for example, Wilton Priory was where Saint Edith was venerated, and her body was there at that point, according to the life and miracles of Saint Edith, composed by Gosselin of Saint Bertin. And I would say that Saint Edith was quite a harsh saint, so her punishments were quite scary on many occasions. So at one point, she punished a man whose name was Agamont and who allegedly stole the lands from Wilton Priory. So he turned into a walking corpse soon after his death, when the friends and family were keeping vigil around his body. And he said that Saint Edith doesn't let his soul move on to the afterlife until he returns the lands. And obviously, it was a bureaucratic process, so he needed to have an audience with the queen. The queen at that time where this narrative was set was Emma, so she refused to see the restless corpse. But after a while, she agreed, and basically the lands were returned and he was allowed to die properly. So his soul left his body. Obviously, nothing of that even more or less relevant happened in the real life, apart from the fact that Wilton was losing the lands. So it was kind of like a feel-good story in a way. So what is interesting about Agamont is that he was like the most highly functioning Walking Dead, probably because he retained the power of like coherent speech and could interact with the living, but he was still not accepted in the living society. And the same goes when a demon is portrayed to occupy the body of somebody who has died. So Gosselin, the same person, Gosselin of Saint Bertin, also wrote the collection of miracles of Saint Edward. And this collection was this collection existed earlier, so Gosselin rewrote it, but in both versions, the earlier version by Herman the Archdiakon and the later version by Gosselin of Saint Bertin, there is an episode of a man called Lev Stan, the evil sheriff, who was persecuting a woman, and she fled from him to the cathedral where Saint Edward's remains were residing. And it offended, obviously, the saint, so he intervened. The woman, persecuted by Lev Stan, fled to the cathedral where the saint's remains relics resided. And he followed her to the cathedral, and he demanded that she is given to him. And this was the offense to the saint. That was the period of history when a persecuted criminal was actually allowed to seek sanctuary in a cathedral. And basically, as the result of the saint's anger, Leo Stan was struck dead immediately, and after that, he didn't rest in peace. So his body would leave the grave and walk around, possessed by the demon. But again, the demon could not just enter his body without the permission from the god. So what was happening, like the logic behind it, was that Saint Edward asked God to let the demon enter the dead man's body. So it's kind of, in a way, also a bit of a, bureaucratic chain of relationship between different real life and supernatural, I would say, humans and entities.
So if it seems like a lot of these are sort of based on, as you said, like, someone's done something bad in their life, and then this is their punishment sort of in their death, to be a walking dead. Is that also how they would be stopped then? Would be like, you were saying in the beginning, like, return the thing you stole, or, is that how they are expected to be able to then rest, or are there other ways that they're kind of supposed to put an end to the walking dead?
So at some point, I actually wrote a list of scenes which turn you into a walking dead, and this is like quite diverse. Some man was actually, again, this comes from William of Newborough, History of English Affairs. A guy was jealous of his wife, and he hid on the ceiling beam and watched her meeting her lover. And then he was so annoyed that he actually fell from the beam and died, and then he was a walking dead. So it's kind of like, this scene of not being able to control, I suppose, your wrath, your emotions. And some scenes were really unspecified. So basically, whatever bad thing you do, you can end up as a walking corpse. So I suppose maybe this could function as cautionary tales, like, do not do bad things in general. The fun thing about ghosts and walking dead is that, like, once you cross this threshold to the afterlife, you lose your agency for some reason. So you can't really pray to God for forgiveness in this new shape. You have to ask the living to pray on your behalf. And obviously, scholars have argued that this was this scheme designed by the Catholic Church to extract money from the living, because you have to pay for masses performed for the sake of the dead. So it was kind of like, I think Jean-Claude Schmidt argued in his monograph that obviously this idea that if you bring money to the church and get them to pray on behalf of the dead, liberates this dead from the purgatorial suffering and lets them move to heaven, basically was feeding into this like ghosts and walking dead narratives. So there is quite a touching story, again, coming from the Byland collection, when a dead man was wandering the village and he was standing by the houses, just by the windows and doors, listening to the living, as if hoping, the narrator writes that it looked like he was hoping that somebody would come out and ask him why he was undead, and then he would be allowed to speak, and then he would tell like, oh, I did such and such thing, could you please pray for me or pay for the masses for my sake to be performed so I can rest in peace. Recently I've been trying to approach it from a new angle. I've been engaging with Freya Matthews' philosophical thought. So Freya Matthews is one of the philosophers who have developed the contemporary modern direction of understanding the panpsychism. So panpsychism is this branch of philosophy when kind of to explain in a very simple way everything in the world have like is interconnected with each other. And so we all like living beings and objects. We're all interconnected in all different types of mutual relationships and mutual responsibilities. And some of the entities can exit this network of connections and responsibilities and relationships, but it usually leads to something bad. So in normal situation, the dead, when they die, of course, we say goodbye to these individuals. They're no longer with us, but they remain part of the interconnected system. They become nourishment for other living organisms. So the death actually creates more life. But the walking dead actually exit this part of relationship because they do not rest in their graves. They do not provide food for other organisms. Instead, they decompose in the air. They pollute the air. William of Newbury wrote about the decomposing walking dead who created infection and killed more people by spreading the infection. So I'm kind of I'm waiting for a review of the article which I wrote on it. I don't know. It may be accepted. It may be not accepted. But this is kind of the direction in which I'm interested in the moment on kind of trying to approach the undead from this like philosophical angle that they used to be part of this community. And if they died normally, they would also remain part of the human community in the way that they would be commemorated in prayers. Their grave would be marked, like their children, their grandchildren, their friends would remember them. But Walking Dead also exclude themselves from this side of, one can say, life after death, because the graves in some cases are destroyed. Because now I'm moving to the situations when in some narratives the undead are really dangerous and aggressive, and people, like in zombie films, attack them and destroy their actual bodies to prevent them from walking further. In the beginning, I've mentioned Geoffrey of Burton's Life and Miracles of Saint Madwena, and the undead there were also spreading the infection by, it's not called infection in the story, but they were basically calling out people's, not calling out people's names. They were like knocking on the doors of the houses and scream something like, "Come and move." And people started to die of illness. And to stop this from happening, the living actually had to dig out these bodies. So another thing about medieval Walking Dead, they do not always walk. They walk around, then they go back to the graves and they chill there for a little bit, and then they come back. So at that point, the living dug out the bodies. They cut off their heads and they placed the heads between the legs. And one of the reasons for that, probably we think, because then the undead person wouldn't be able to find the head and to reattach it back. Because again, in the medieval worldview, the head of the dead person could grow back to the body, which happened to Saint Edward, for example. And on top of that, in that particular narrative from Saint Madwenna's life, the living also cut out the hearts of these undead individuals and set them on fire. And the hearts were kind of burning for a really long time, and then they cracked and let out an evil spirit in the shape of a raven. So this is very elaborate narrative of like how to get rid of a walking corpse. It also corresponds to our modern representations of zombies. And it also means that these individuals' graves would not be of the same status as like the ordinary dead's graves. So their graves were destroyed. So they would not be commemorated by the livings. They will never be part of the society in terms of our memory of the dead.
So when you were talking before about kind of using excavation reports as well when doing your research, what is it exactly that you're looking for? Is it this mutilation, the head being cut off or the heart being taken out, or is it something else that you were looking for?
I'm so glad you've asked. I love talking about excavation reports. So John Blair wrote a very interesting article, and he looked at several case studies. I do not agree with his point. I think he has done a fantastic research, but I'm inclined to interpret his case studies in a bit different way. And the reason why it happens is that if we look at the injuries sustained, so we can say like somebody cut off the person's head and then buried the body with the head in the grave, or like somebody cut off the person's head after they died, it doesn't make a difference because obviously in both cases, if the decapitation was the cause of death, or if the decapitation occurred after death, there will not be obviously any evidence of healing. John Blair mentioned a very interesting case study of an Anglo-Saxon burial when the body is so the feet are cut at the ankles and placed in the grave, and there are no evidence of healing. And he argues that this was made to prevent this person from walking after death. But again, we don't know. This could be an unsuccessful attempt of amputation, which has gone wrong. Another thing with that particular grave is that it's very shallow, and the body has traces of injuries in the neck kind of part when the neck meets the spine, and its head in the grave is kind of positioned in this like chin to the chest. So another thing I was thinking about when reading this excavation report is that like the body barely fit in the grave. And I was thinking maybe they cut off the feet because otherwise it wouldn't fit. And it's very gruesome, and it's kind of has to do a lot with like we need more research on like the Anglo-Saxon perspectives of the body. Like, do you need to respect the dead body, or do you just want to bury it whatever way and just be done with that? But what I'm trying to say is that the interpretation of post-mortem the interpretation of the evidence of trauma in the dead body is very there are many there are very many ways to interpret the evidence of damage and the evidence of trauma. So we can't really jump to conclusions that this was necessarily damages sustained after death and which were made to prevent the person from walking. Another thing is that obviously we analyze the biggest area for analysis is obviously the cemeteries where we can find deviant burials. So burials which are different from the majority if they're buried in an awkward position, for example, face down. Paul Barber, who wrote on Eastern European folk beliefs and fears of the vampire, has argued that the potentially dangerous dead could be buried face down because if they try to dig their way out of the grave, they will dig downwards instead. But again, when we are talking about the cemeteries, they are not as deviant burials as those burials which would be isolated. And to locate an isolated medieval burial, you have to be very lucky. It doesn't happen normally, of course. So I suppose, and in the medieval Walking Dead narratives, this is exactly what happened. So some of the undead were described to be thrown in a ditch somewhere far away from the neighborhood, from the village. So they were not in the cemetery. So these burials are nearly impossible to locate if they exist in the modern time.
Yeah, it's interesting. You just, when you mentioned the feet being cut off, it reminded me of a skeleton that one of my colleagues analyzed from a site. I think it was one of the only burials they found. It was in a ring ditch or something, so not even a purpose-made grave. But they had either one or both of their feet cut off, and then were placed slightly next to them, and they couldn't figure out why they did that.
Oh my God, this is fascinating. Can I talk to your colleague about that? Because I
need to reach out and be like, what was that story? There was some story you mentioned about feet and then the person being separate. I'll have to email her and ask her.
Because I have to add a disclaimer. I'm not a trained archaeologist, so I was working with archaeological excavation reports, but I would always welcome an input from an actual archaeologist who knows more about analyzing human remains.
Yeah, it is interesting because there are certain ones that we know of or that we've heard of. You get skeletons sometimes where the person will have a stone in their mouth and people think that's they're witches or something like that. Or, there's these different sort of deviant burial traditions that people associate with supernatural beliefs from the past. But there's kind of pushback against them sometimes as well to say oh, well, it could also just be that a stone fell in at some point and it wasn't purposely placed there. There's always there's the supernatural belief, and you're well, there's just physics and geology and everything involved.
That was what I keep thinking about as well. I've read about the stones in the mouth. One thing which I don't know how to connect it or whether it should be connected at all. There is a collection recorded in the 19th century by Mary Balfour, and she did this ethnographic, type of work in Lincolnshire, and she basically wrote down local stories, and one of the stories is it's very beautiful. It's called The Dead Moon, and basically there are swamps, and people are afraid of swamps because all kind of supernatural beings, including the undead, are haunting the swamps at night. So people are afraid to go there at night. But when the moon comes out, they can travel safely because all these kind of creepy things hide away from the moonlight. And at some point, the moon wants to visit the earth. So she kind of turns into a woman, and she goes down and she walks through the swamps. And then all these creatures see her, and they think this is our time to capture her, because then the moon will never shine and we can do whatever we like. So they catch the moon. And after that, the locals suffer a lot because they can no longer travel safely at night through the swamps and through the marshes. And they go to this wise woman, which is like basically a village witch. And she tells them how to liberate the moon. And they take several types of precautions how to not be harmed by these like evil creatures. And one of them is they put stones in their mouths. But I don't know why they do it.
It is always interesting when you compare like what people people think are superstitions, and then you're like, I don't know that really matches up with what is the reality of what's going on.
Yes, because I'm also thinking like, could people who compose the story, if somebody discovered a body with a stone in the mouth, which ended up there accidentally. So we never know. I think, as they say, more research is needed in this field.
Yeah. I do also find it interesting sometimes, where it's like, what came first, the superstition or the like burial? Is it that like someone saw something like that and therefore came up with the theory, or did the superstition exist and then people are then seeing it in practice, or kind of what came first?
And I'm also thinking that we inevitably apply our modern standards and our way of thinking to interpreting these things. So perhaps it was nothing like we think. Unfortunately, there are these limitations as well.
So you mentioned in your email to me as well that one of the things you were researching was kind of that there are stories of sort of romantic relationships between the undead and the living. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, actually now I can throw in a plug-in. I think I wrote like a popular history essay about it, which is going to be published in February in a magazine called Chalk. So it's a recently started popular scientific publication. So it I like the way that it's scheduled for February, because this also will be kind of around Valentine's Day. But basically, some of the undead are described to come back and kind of try to enter a sexual relationship with the living. Sometimes, actually, there is a story coming not from the medieval period, but from the classical antiquity, I would say late antiquity. And it was written by Phlegon of Thrales, who was a Greek freedman. And he wrote about a guy whose name was Machates, and Machates stayed at a family friend's house. I'm kind of maybe theorizing that he needed an accommodation to staying, and this family rented him a spare room, and the spare room, we know from the story, used to belong to the family's daughter who has died. So after their daughter died, they started renting out this room. And she kept visiting the house and she started an affair with this young man. So again, I'm theorizing that she just wanted to check on her room and what was happening after she died. And she was missing her room, perhaps. Probably not clearly, she was not decomposing because the guy didn't know that she was dead. And he gave her some presents. I think he gave her an iron ring, and she would take these presents back to her tomb. So when her tomb was opened, these like little things he gave her were discovered there, which is kind of cute. And how it ended, the servant spied on them, and she reported to the parents that your daughter is coming to visit this guy. And the parents were obviously very happy, and they kind of walked on them. And the daughter was really, really upset that they walked on them. And she said, like, if you are like this, I'm going to die now for real. And she died for for good. There is a bit of a sad ending because the guy committed the suicide because he was traumatized that he was in a relationship with a dead person. But it's really like a corpse bride situation. Goethe wrote a poem based on it. It's called Corinthian Bride. And he reinterprets the events a little bit. So the girl and the young man are betrothed to each other by their families. So they're supposed to marry each other when they grow up. But then the girl's family converts to Christianity. So they can't marry any longer. And she dies of grief. And as a dead woman, when the guy visits this family as a guest, he stays over in their house for a night, and she appears to him as a dead woman. And basically tries to get in death what she couldn't get in life. Again, when people when people talk about these stories, they interpret it only as this kind of dead, in this context, dead women kind of having this like sexual appetite. But I personally see it as something more. I see it as, again, they wanted to be part of a relationship systems which we humans create. So because marriage, romantic relationship is also a system of mutual responsibilities and mutual interactions. And they don't like to be excluded from the system. So this is my interpretation. I think it's not just about this kind of corporeal love, but also willing to be part of like human social structures. Another situation, again, what can happen is that the devil moves around that body and makes it seduce the living. There is like an insane account by Jean de Maillet. I translated it from Latin together with my Latin language teacher from Lancaster University, John Thorley. He was a great help to all the PhD students and master students working with Latin sources. So we had this Latin translation sessions with myself and my PhD colleagues and John. And that account by Jean de Maillet, it was like insanely difficult to translate, partly because he also wasn't really good in Latin grammar himself. So you kind of don't know 100% what he was trying to say because the grammar is really incorrect. But if we translated it correctly, there was a guy who didn't want to work on a saint's feast day. And as punishment, the saint kind of struck his leg. So one of his leg became like, he started to limp, basically. And at some point, so he goes on a quest to beg for forgiveness and ask for a new leg. He gets a new leg at some point. But after that, he becomes very pious. So he locks himself in a monastery cell and he starts praying all the time. And the devil is not happy about seeing him being so pious. So he enters the body of a dead woman who comes to his cell every night and tries to seduce him. And the more he refuses, the more persistent the woman becomes. And at some point, there are some knights hanging out outside of the cell, and they see him with the woman, and this kind of fortifies him. So he sees like there are like other people around. So he takes this like priest stole, so this piece of like fabric, and he strangles the woman with it. And after that, the devil exits her body. I, again, personally believe that if it happened for real, this was just like a monk having sex, which he wasn't supposed to do. And when the knights saw him, he found like an incredibly ugly way out of the situation. But the way it was recorded is that like the devil can enter somebody's dead body and use it to seduce living people, which is like terrifying on many levels.
Is it always the women who are the dead ones and the men who are the living ones?
Not always. So the man who forgot that he was dead, he came to enter his wife's bed. But the person's name who wrote it was Alessandro Alessandri. It's an early modern account. And it's about a friend, like a male friend, who buried, so a guy who buried his male friend, and then he was going back and he spent the night in an inn, and this dead friend came to his inn and got in bed with him. And the living person could feel how cold the body of his dead friend is. So he started kicking him. So he literally kicked him out of the bed. Again, I don't know how to interpret this story, because if it was it could be an account of same-sex relationship, because obviously in the early modern sources, they could be quite discreet with their wording. At the same time, we know that in the medieval early modern period, people were much easier about sharing the same bed with like each other, including friends sharing the same bed. So I think it's open to interpretation the way a particular scholar wants to see it. But yeah, it's not always women in this context. It's guys as well.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was some commentary about women or something going on there, because previously I had someone on, Jay, who researched mummy literature in the Victorian era, and she was saying how there was female mummies who seduced the living as well.
Oh
so
my God.
I wonder if there's something about that.
I need to listen to it now, because I think it's something which corresponds to what I've been reading in my sources too. There is always some like femme fatale idea about this, like a dead woman seducing the living, even though it sounds really disturbing.
Yeah, I don't quite understand that one. I'm like, but they're dead. Even if they're not decomposing, they're still dead.
Yeah, I know, but there are also, sorry if I'm being like way too disturbing, but there are also accounts of necrophilia in medieval narratives. So I think the same type of story appears in Gervais of Tilbury's Recreation for the Emperor, which is like a collection of like stories about some miracles and marvels and supernatural occurrences. And a similar story also can be found in Walter Map's Cartier's Trifles, but which is the same type of genre. So it's also like a collection of like fun, miraculous and marvelous stories. And there is like about a man who really fell in love with some woman who he couldn't marry for like a status difference. So she would be like from a rich family, he would be from a poor family, and then he goes. I think in Walter Map's version, he becomes a pirate. So he kind of tries to become rich in an not socially approved way. And then he comes back and he discovers that she has died while she had died while he was away. And he is unable to bear this loss, and he because he felt he was so close to actually being with her, but now it's over. So he finds her grave after the funerals at night, and he makes sex. He has sex with the corpse, which sounds awful. And then the dead body produces, as a result of this intercourse, the dead body gives birth to a Medusa head, which is like turns people to stone. So it's a very disturbing account. And I don't want to think about the reasons why people wrote about it.
Yeah, you don't want to think too hard about the reality
exactly.
of the underlying story.
Yes, some really life interpretations can be avoided.
So this has all been really interesting for like a topic that I didn't even know existed before you reached out to me. I'm now like really interested in all of this. It's been fascinating. Has there been anything we haven't discussed yet that you feel like people should know about this topic?
Oh my God, I've talked so much over the past hour. I felt like I hope I'm not going to bore everybody because, nothing urgent comes to mind at this point.
Well, you definitely won't bore people because this is
that's good to know. But yeah, I wanted to say thank you again because I think it's lovely that you're creating this community of people who are interested in the history of our understandings of life and death and life after death. I find it really fascinating that, like, during our conversation, you have mentioned a few scholars and their research, and I kept thinking, like, wow, this is so interesting and this is so relevant, and I really want to learn more about these people's research and borrow their expertise and learn from the expertise, because I think we would find out more about the historical understandings of death if we talk more to each other. So I think it's a lovely podcast series. So thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. That's so kind. But yeah, it is like I made this podcast to, get the general public interested in archaeology and the more morbid stuff in history and things like that. But as I've been interviewing people, it's also sort of become like a interdisciplinary, like, melding of things as well. I'm always learning new things now. If I ever see cut off feet in a grave, I'm gonna wonder if it's got something to do with Walking Dead and zombies, which I never would have contemplated before. I would have just thought failed amputation and left it at that. So it's also been like, now it's going to change my perspective on things too.
Yeah, I'm glad. I'm glad that I've contributed to your perspective too. But thank you so much. It's been a very fun conversation for me, and I haven't touched the Walking Dead for a bit because my postdoctoral project was on a different thing. So it was really nice and nostalgic to go back to them for an evening.
Yes. So if anyone is interested in learning more, I'll make sure to leave links to everything that you have published as well. I believe you also have a website too.
Oh yeah, it's kind of, I haven't updated it in a while, but it exists. So like, do you have it? Shall I send it to you?
Yeah, you sent it to me in an email.
So I did already. Okay. Okay, perfect.
Yes. So thank you everyone so much for listening, and thank you to Polina for being on. This has been so fascinating, and I now have more research to do. So thank you so much. And thank you to the listeners, and I will see you all in next week's episode. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye. Thank you.